Welcome, I'm the Deadwood Jedi. This is going to be another Raid Shadow Legends video, and today I want to talk about counterattack in Clan Boss. There's only 3 counterattack champions in the entirety of the games that do it AoE. Skullcrusher, Martyr, Valkyrie. That's it. That's all we got. So utilizing them is a little bit different from utilizing any other champion in this game. And they each have very different kits outside of the counterattack ability, which makes them rather unique in how you're going to speed tune with them. And so I kind of want to talk a little bit more in general terms. I'm not going to show a lot of footage as far as like, you know, running them or building them up necessarily, but I wanted to discuss a little bit about each one in turn, how I would use them, what kind of teams I would use them for, and maybe even some champions they would pair really well with. Of course, before we get into that, I do want to remind you guys to go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit that notification bell, because if you're getting good and valuable information out of these videos, I want you to be able to get it all the time. You don't want to miss out on the next one when you have a chance to improve your teams. And it's also a great way to support this work so I can continue to put more of these videos out there for you guys. So if you do enjoy this type of thing, don't forget to hit those buttons. I would really appreciate it. So let's start off talking about the epic version of this counterattack champion's Skullcrusher. Now, Skullcrusher is a really good champion for this game. As an epic champion, is one of only 3 that brings counterattack. Now, let's look at his kit so we get a full understanding. His A1 has a heal reduction ability. For Clan Boss, we absolutely don't want that. It's a waste of a debuff slot. So typically, we're not going to build him with any accuracy. His A2 ability is that counterattack. Now, he doesn't place it on himself, and we kind of have to keep that in mind when utilizing him. But he does place an unkillable buff on himself, as well as an ally protection ability on all your other allies. And so a lot of times, not only are we using Skullcrusher for the counterattack ability, but we're also using him to keep everybody else alive with that ally protection. And because he puts unkillable on himself, it lends to some interesting build ways to build your champions and to keep him alive. Very last thing I do want to point out about his kit, he has this passive ability that decreases the duration of all debuffs on this champion by 1 turn at the start of each turn. There's interesting thing about this that I don't know that everybody knows out there. It's one of those things that's well known in the community, but isn't necessarily talked about. Skullcrusher, while he will remove the stun debuff if he gets stunned, it will still hold his cooldown of his skills. Because it happens at the start of his turn has already begun. That means his skills have already delayed their cooldown ability from the stun. So while he'll still get a turn to do an attack, his skills won't cool down. So if you ever want Skullcrusher to take the stun, or if he happens to be getting the stun regularly in your Clan Boss team, you're going to want to build in an extra turn in his kit, because even though his counterattack ability is on a 3-turn cooldown when booked, because of that passive skill, if he gets stunned, it's going to take an extra turn to cool down. So it's going to act like a 4-turn cooldown ability, even with that passive skill. So you do need to keep that in mind. And that's going to be important for things like if you run him in an unkillable team with, say, a tower. The tower Skullcrusher team is a really good example of this, where he's designed to take the stun. Typically, we bring in a cleanser so that skill doesn't go on cooldown, or you run him at a 4-3 ratio without a cleanser, so it doesn't even matter, and his skill will happen regularly. So that's something important to keep in mind. And that does bring me to a point. He places an unkillable ability on himself, as well as an ally protection and counterattack on all your allies. That means that if counterattack is on all your allies, the Clan Boss tries to avoid that, which means Skullcrusher is a prime stun target. That works great for us when we're building unkillable teams and we need someone to take the stun, like in those tower Skullcrusher teams, right? But it can be a negative thing when we're running a traditional Clan Boss team and we don't want Skullcrusher to take the stun. That can actually be a really big problem. So one of the things you do have to be careful is bringing somebody that, like a Godseeker or Neri or a Sandlast Survivor, that gives you a buff extension. Because what can happen is you can extend that unkillable buff all the way to the stun attack from the Clan Boss, and because he's the only one that doesn't have counterattack on, he'll be the preferred stun target of the Clan Boss. Now, affinity usually trumps all the buffs and debuffs and stuff, but you know, on Void especially, Skullcrusher will be the likely target in those cases, and that can be a problem. So that's something always to keep in mind as you're building with him. Now, one of the other things with Skullcrusher is he's a defensive based champion. So if we want more damage out of him, we need to build him with higher defense. The other thing to remember is that he is an ally protection champion. So typically with ally protection, we want to actually build their HP up because they're taking additional damage from your allies and they're not reducing their own damage. We typically want to build their defense to, around that 4,000 mark, somewhere between 4,000 and 4,800 defense without an increased defense buff. With an increased defense buff, somewhere around 3,000 is usually good, but we can always build it a little bit higher. And so for a Skullcrusher, because he's a defensive based champion, because he has ally protection, I will typically aim to get him somewhere between 3,000 to 4,000 defense, depending on whether I have that increased defense buff or not. Even with that buff, I will generally try to build that defense close to 4,000. And then as far as the HP goes, I want that as high as I possibly can. Now, the tricky part, of course, is he has that unkillable ability. So, typically what you do on your teams is you have your ally protect or your counterattack champion go last in the turn order, right? And so one of the things we tried to do with a champion like a Skullcrusher is have him go last in the turn order. He puts ally protection on everybody else and he's unkillable. So no problem with that first AoE. The problem comes in the second AoE, where all of a sudden, because of the unkillable ability, he's still taking that damage. He doesn't die, but he now has 0 HP, and we have to heal him back up. So one of the important things is, obviously, you're going to want Life Drinker on his kit. The other thing is you're probably going to want 100% crit rate. When War Master procs off of him, he's going to heal off of that through the Life Drinker. You can put him in Lifesteal gear is a really good option for that. You can use a Leech debuff, but he needs to do damage to heal back up, and him healing back up is crucial. And so those are kind of a lot of the things that I look at when I'm building Skullcrusher as far as how to maximize this kit and keep your team alive as much as possible. As far as building a team around Skullcrusher, there's a couple things I like to do. I like to bring in increased defense champions, right? Skullcrusher doesn't necessarily need that for that first AoE, but he definitely will want that for the second AoE, right? Where he's vulnerable again. So bringing an increased defense champion can be really, really important. The other thing I really like to do is bring in another ally protection champion for that second AoE. And so a champion, especially like Jareg, can be extremely good because I can put him at a 4-3 ratio. He'll give us increased defense and that ally protection and help make sure Skullcrusher stays alive for that second AoE. Having that combo can be really, really helpful for staying alive. The next champion I want to talk about is Martyr. And Martyr is a phenomenal counterattack champion, but a lot of times I would actually choose to use Skullcrusher instead of Martyr. And there's some good reasons why. Skullcrusher gives you that ally protection. It's such a good survivability skill that Martyr just can't equate to. There's no getting around that. In a lot of teams, Skullcrusher is going to be better than Martyr as far as keeping your entire team alive. And because of that, if you can survive longer, you'll do more damage. But Martyr does some things that Skullcrusher doesn't, and Martyr is going to be uniquely good for unkillable teams. Actually, one of the best unkillable champions in this game. Not only does she bring counterattack, which of course is really great because you're getting extra attacks, but she has a decreased defense on her A1 skill. And that can be really, really helpful. This book's up to like a 70-75% chance to land, which is really high. And so especially with counterattack, you're going to be landing that all the time. Now she does have a decreased attack skill here, but it's not consistent enough. It's on a 4-turn cooldown, and we're not generally going to prioritize that. So this is not a skill that I generally will focus on with her or use her for, though she can be really good for that if you need it, right? Especially with 2-1 ratio teams where you're getting that attack often enough to really kind of consider it up all the time. That can be a good option. But the best part about her is this A2 skill, which brings that counterattack buff. On top of that, it also brings an increased defense buff. And that can be really helpful because not only does increased defense make her do more damage and any other defensive champions more damage, it's also going to help your team stay alive a lot longer. So there's definitely some teams where if you have ally protection from other champions, bringing in a Martyr can be the choice to do, a better choice even than having a Skullcrusher on that team. And on top of that, she does more raw damage than any of these other ally or any of these other counterattack champions do. She hits extremely hard, as good as just about anybody out there in this game. So for Clan Boss, she is one of the best options, especially for unkillable teams. Now, for a traditional team, maybe not as good as some of the other ones because she's not going to bring survivability. She's going to give you that increased defense buff, so that means you don't need to have it from somebody else. She's going to bring a decreased defense, so you don't need to have that from somebody else, on top of all the counterattack as well. So Martyr is a phenomenal champion. Oh, I should mention, she also has the best defensive aura in this game, or one of them, at 33%, all battles. Really, really strong. So there is a lot to love about this champion, but it's really going to depend on the team that you're building. Now, for me, one of the things I love to do is have an unkillable team with Martyr and pair her with a Geomancer. Geomancer gives you that weaken ability, and then Martyr gives you that decreased defense. It's like a match made in heaven. It's really, really good combination. You can even bring in somebody like an Underpriest Brogni, who's going to give you those shields, going to give you those block debuffs, and make your team affinity friendly. This is one of the types of teams I love to use. You could also bring in somebody like a Rosin, who hits unbelievably hard, and with the increased defense buff from Martyr can be extremely good for your teams. So there are a lot of options as far as approaches to this and using her. But you know, with traditional teams, it's the one thing you're just going to want to try to do is make sure you have somebody else that is bringing you ally protection when you utilize Martyr with them, or like a big shield or something to help keep your team alive, because that's the one thing that Martyr doesn't do. Depending on the team that you're building her around, she can be the best option for you. It just really depends on that team. And the last champion might be my favorite champion. One of the first champions I ever got in this game is Valkyrie, and she's just absolutely insane for clan boss. One of the best in this game. And the biggest reason is this A2 skill. Not only does it give you that AoE counterattack, but it also gives you the biggest shield in this game. And I do mean that, the biggest shield in this game, because it's based off of her defense. The shield is, I believe, equivalent to 4 times her defense value. And so this is why when we build Valkyrie, we build her with like 7, 8, 9,000 defense on her. Absolutely insane numbers. But the reason why is because the bigger her defense, the bigger that shield becomes. So one of the most important things when you have Valkyrie on your team is to make sure that you bring an increased defense buff. That is vital. You don't necessarily have to have her with that buff all the time, but what you want to make sure is at the start of her turn, maybe not by the end, but definitely at the start of her turn, before she uses that A2 skill, that she has an increased defense buff on her, because that buff is going to make that shield that much bigger. So that is absolutely the most important thing with her. When I build a Valkyrie, the most important thing is her defense. I don't care about crit rate. I don't care about anything else. I don't even care about her HP. All I want is as much defense as I humanly can put on her, and having her at the appropriate speeds. That's really it. And it can be a massive thing for your team. She will enable incredible survivability. With her shield alone, with that increased defense buff, most teams will last till turn 40 without much else going on with the team. And so, you know, that's better really than even ally protection on your champion. So utilizing her, and even if you can add ally protection, can be a massive boost to the survivability of your team. And that's how we get a lot of teams lasting well beyond 50 turns, because of her shield and because of ally protection, or champions like Underpriest Brogni that will increase the value of that shield, which can be absolutely insane as well. She's a very fun champion to utilize. Now, there are some things you have to be careful with her. Most specifically, she has a passive skill here, Jealousy, and this is going to increase her turn meter every time that clan boss puts that buff on themselves. And that can be a little bit tricky when you're trying to stay in tune. Now, there are some ways to counteract this, and I have some Valkyrie affinity tunes on the website. They're a little bit tricky, and so one of the things I would just recommend when it comes to Valkyrie, try to use only champions that are on a 1-1 ratio. This is going to give you the most consistent result and be good regardless of the difficulty, right? Try to keep your champions on a 1-1 ratio, and then have Valkyrie at 171 speed and everybody else basically 185 to 189 speed. If you can do that, what that's going to do is mean that there's enough of a gap where even with that 10% turn meter boost, Valkyrie isn't going to outspeed anybody on your team, and she'll stay last in the turn order and keep it affinity friendly going forward. So that's one of the tricks that I've used to build with her. You know, one of the other advantages of that shield, if you can get it to, if you can bring in somebody like a Godseeker Neri or a Sandlash to extend that buff, it will help a lot with the stun as well, because the stun is based off your champion's max HP, and the shield acts like bonus HP. So the attack doesn't factor that in, but all of a sudden your champion now has a bunch more HP than they're supposed to. And that'll help them stay alive a lot longer. In fact, I think I have a build on the website where you utilize a tower, Rosh card, the tower, with Valkyrie, and Valkyrie is actually providing the stun targeting for you. That shield essentially makes your team unkillable. I mean, it's not unkillable, but you'll easily last 40 turns with her shield blocking the stun itself. She's great, obviously, in other areas of this game, amazing for arena and stuff, and she can do okay damage. It's worth building her with a 100% crit rate, but it's not really worth building her with a ton of crit damage. She's not a very strong damage dealer, and it's not something I would focus on with her build. Really, the only thing I would do is make sure she's at speed, and then make sure she has as much defense as humanly possible. She's incredibly good. You don't even need a lot of healing outside of that. And if you have an Underpriest Brogni, because of his passive ability, your healing will be absolutely insane. So I think Valkyrie is one of my favorite champions and absolutely one of the best counterattack champions. But when we talk about these three counterattack champions, each one is going to have their own place in the game. And depending on the team, you're going to want to make sure you're choosing the right one. So for counterattack champions, it really does depend on the team that you're building. If you're building like a ally protection team, especially something like a Taragi the Frog and a Brogni team, or like a 2-1 ratio team, right? Where you're like really kind of going at a lot of speed, champions like Skullcrusher or Martyr can be exceedingly valuable for those squads, right? They're doing a lot of extra work for you, either adding another ally protection champion, or they're bringing more damage to the table, or that increased defense buff that can be really useful, and maybe a lot more useful than, say, Valkyrie. Because the thing is, Valkyrie only brings that shield with the counterattack. And while that's a massive skill, sometimes it won't fit for your team. And so you got to be a little bit careful. On top of that, her passive ability will mess a little bit with those 2-1 ratio teams. Now, she's incredibly good though, and definitely somebody I would look to bring into your team if you can. I've done a lot of 2-1 ratio teams utilizing Valkyrie, so she's definitely somebody that you can bring into those squads. It's just something you're also going to want to pay attention to, and make sure you pay attention to the guidance on the website when utilizing those champions. Skullcrusher is going to be great for a lot of squads and is probably one of the more versatile of these champions by bringing that ally protection that is such a valuable ability for you. And then Martyr, of course, can be used for any of these teams. That's really the beauty of her, is she can be utilized anywhere. She's not going to require anything special as far as speed tuning, not going to require anything special as far as, building a team around her, but optimizing her kit for your team can take a little bit of work. And so it's just something to kind of pay attention to as far as going about that, right? One last note on Valkyrie I should mention is there is a way to not worry about the affinity stuff and kind of counteract that, and that's by bringing a block buffs ability. Champions like Tuhanarok or even a champion like Vizier can do that for you. And while that might not optimize your damage necessarily, it might make sure that your speed tune works without having to worry about affinity affecting Valkyrie's speed tuning. There are a couple different things that you can look at and think about as far as how you're going to want to build these champions. But if you have counterattack champions, most of the time you're going to want to try to bring them in if you can, because it can be extremely valuable. If you're doing unkillable, I recommend Martyr. I don't really recommend Skullcrusher or Valkyrie because they don't do good raw damage, and you'll benefit more from ally attack champions instead, or just raw damage champions. And if you're doing a traditional team, I generally will lean towards Skullcrusher or Valkyrie because they bring more survivability to the comp than Martyr does necessarily. But as always, depends on the individual team. Anyway, guys, I hope this was helpful for you and a little bit insightful. I just kind of wanted to share this information because I get these questions about these champions pretty periodically. Pretty periodically? Fairly often? From time to time? Occasionally. Anyway, guys, hopefully you enjoyed this, and I really do look forward to the next time I talk to you. If you guys have any questions or comments, please leave them down below in the comment section. I would like to hear from you guys what you think about these counterattack champions, if you're using them in your team, or if you have other questions about how do you best utilize them or best build them. I would definitely be interested in hearing that. So that's all we've got for today. Till next we meet, I'm the Deadwood Jedi.